Hello everyone, it's Ren here. Welcome to my room, guys. Saturday, happy Saturday. Today, I'm going to start the afternoon with this little talk with you about a topic that many people would not see as fit for weekend leisure, but we don't really care about that. Now we're going to explore further the question of the shadow and what it means for our cognitive functions, because I feel like even after having made some videos lately that discuss this topic in some detail, there's still territory to explore. So hopefully you bear with me. Just remember quickly that I have a Patreon page. You can follow me at the link below. Thanks for your support, and thanks to my current supporters. Really appreciate you. And my two books, The Infinite Castle, my latest novel, and The Ecstatic Soul, my book on the INFJ, both available below at the appropriate Amazon links. So what had I left with the last time I made a video where I discussed the shadow? Well, first of all, following Jung in a broad outline, we defined it as that section of the personal unconscious that is repressed, because it is a source of shame, a source of distrust, a source of what we don't like about ourselves. Now, one thing that we should immediately say is that repression, which is a term that sounds like it's intuitively obvious what it means, but it actually stands in need of probably a slightly more precise definition. Again, following Jung, we could define repression as deliberate forgetfulness. We literally, our conscious world, our conscious self, forgets about something that is not desired in the living memory. So it remains in the memory tank of the unconscious, but it's no longer accessible. It's why it's repressed. Comes back to the surface on occasion of certain events, which can cause neuroses and so on. And again, within the personal unconscious, which itself is not the whole of the unconscious. If we follow Jung, there's the collective unconscious. The personal unconscious is that region which really pertains to the individual. The shadow is not the entirety of the personal unconscious. It really is the repressed part of the personal unconscious, because there are other parts of the personal conscious. For example, there are memories that literally, we lost over time, not because they were repressed, just because it's been a long time and we don't remember things, right? There are things that we have forgotten. And it's that process of forgetting is not linked to a mechanism of repression. That's in the personal unconscious as well. These contents are never completely lost. Another region of the personal unconscious, which is not in the shadow, is subliminal experiences of things in the environment. So you perceive, walk down the street, and at some point you might see, I don't know, like someone that vaguely resembles someone else, but you don't really think about it too much, and it doesn't stick to your perceptual field, or a tree that looks kind of an interesting shape, or a particular kind of shade or color. There's lots of different kind of liminal, subliminal experiences that are perceptual and that do not remain within our conscious field, because our consciousness constantly has to engage in a process of judgment/discrimination. But it does enter our unconscious. It's part of the personal unconscious, not part of the shadow. So the shadow is what's repressed. Okay. Now, in the again, in the recent video I made about the shadow and 8 function models, I was countering the idea, trying to refute the idea that there could be such a thing as an independent cognitive makeup of the shadow, specifically a cognitive makeup which would include dominant function, an auxiliary function, a tertiary function, and an inferior function. In the case of an INFJ, that would be NEFITESI. So what would be the conscious makeup of an ENFP? In the case of an INFP, it would be FENISETI, so the conscious makeup of an ENFJ. So that's how a lot of people understand the shadow. And that doesn't make a lot of sense because, as I tried to sort of elaborate on before, the contents of the unconscious, and that applies to the contents of the personal unconscious, and within it, the contents of the shadow, the repressed contents. Well, they're unconscious for a reason. Part of why they're unconscious is that they're not invested with enough psychic energy that they make it to the surface of consciousness. If there is attaching to them enough psychic energy, they rise up to the level of consciousness. And with that process comes an increase in resolution. Sometimes people, philosophers, for instance, talk about determinacy, determinate contents. The more determinate a content is, the more high resolution it is, which means that the more you can discriminate between that content and another type of content that belongs to the sphere of judgment. In the unconscious domain, so to speak, there is not really a function of judgment, because since these contents are not attached to high enough doses of psychic energy, they remain at a relatively indeterminate stage. They kind of mix with each other, they blend with each other. You could, to use an example, just an illustration of what I mean, you can picture an apple that doesn't really look like an apple. It sort of looks like an apple, but also like a pear. And so you can't really figure out, is it an apple or is it a pear, right? So in the conscious world, we have apples and we have pears. But in the unconscious, you have to imagine that we have these constellation of strange entities that are somehow, yes, they are apples, but they're kind of also pears. And so they, as long as there is like a family resemblance between it and another content, automatically these two tend to link together in this. So they create these constellations of contents that they exist, and they definitely have an influence on the conscious personality, but they're not psychically energetic enough to have the high resolution to make it to consciousness. And therefore, since they are in this relatively kind of vague state, they certainly don't have the potential to be articulated in terms of cognitive makeup. But that is not to say that they are not in some sense autonomous. So it's important to make the distinction between the shadow having a cognitive makeup, which is not possible, and the shadow being autonomous from the conscious personality and its activities, intentions, desires, wants, actions, plans, and so on, projects. The shadow is not an independent subject living inside the conscious ego, but it does have a certain autonomy in the sense that it does things that are not, they're not thought through like a conscious ego would do, but they don't follow the path that the conscious ego would like it to follow. It often goes contrary to that path, which is why there is this tension of opposites. And Jung believes that that's inevitable for anyone, and that this tension of opposites is the source, the very sort of wellspring of psychic energy without which we could not live, because we'd have no fuel to go on. The will would have no fuel to go on. So this conflict of opposites is absolutely essential. It's not something that is pathological. What is pathological is a state where the unconscious contents take over, in a sense. They influence the conscious personality so much that the adaptability and directed thinking that are constitutive of the conscious ego's world become impaired by this impinging influence of shadow contents. But that's not equivalent to saying that there's an independent person living inside our person. So that's an important element to reiterate. Now, in relation to 8 function models, I have a friend who recently pointed out that it is true that this argument against the shadow having a cognitive makeup of its own does not thereby invalidate all possible 8 function models. It only invalidates 8 function models insofar as those models attach 4 functions to the conscious personality and 4 other functions that do not belong to the conscious personality, but would attach to the shadow personality. So that, as we have seen, that's not possible. But it is true that it would be possible, in theory, for a model to not bother itself with anything like the shadow, not to claim that the shadow has a personality of its own, at least not at the high level resolution of the conscious personality, so determined that it incorporates a discrimination between 4 cognitive functions. It's still possible to imagine that we all operate in the world. Our type has a certain hierarchy of functions, which is not a hierarchy of 4, but a hierarchy of 8. And notice the difference. This is not saying that the conscious ego has 4 functions and the shadow has another 4. It's to say that the conscious ego has the 8 functions, right, in potential. What's in the unconscious is, if you like, the hidden part of the iceberg. So even in Jung, the way we understand him, and if we elaborate on him a little bit, we could come to the conclusion that, there really are just 4 functions in an individual, not 8. And that insofar as there are functional contents in the unconscious, they're just these parts of each of our conscious functions that remain relatively unintegrated. So it's true that, my dominant function is an INFJ, my auxiliary, my tertiary, and even more so my inferior, they're not going to be completely above the threshold of consciousness. Presumably, NI and FE would be mostly above, but there's still going to be some unconscious remnants in here, that kind of feed this conflict of opposites. And the more I progress toward the more inferior functions, the more the lower, the sort of hidden part of the iceberg below the water, the submerged part, occupies the bigger space than the part that's, above the threshold. So here, there is no inherent contradiction if someone were to come forward and say, well, actually, I take all that, but let me just have the 8 functions in this hierarchy rather than just the 4. You could have that, So that person presumably would say something along the lines of, well, an INFJ would have their dominant function NI and then just have the hierarchy, but instead of stopping at SE, it goes all the way to SI. And so SI is the function, in this case, 8th function, inferior 8th function, would have the largest submerged part. It's presumably mostly very unconscious. And SE would be kind of in the middle, okay? I don't think that that's impossible. That's a theory that you could develop, and I'm sure that someone on the internet has developed it. The one thing to be aware of, and that's just constraints that to be aware of, but it doesn't mean anything more than that, is that if you embrace a model like this, in some sense you're really departing from the Jungian model, which also means that you cannot all at once depart from the Jungian model and then presume to derive the benefits of the Jungian model that you have just abandoned. Maybe that deserves another video that I will make at a later point to explore this in a bit more detail. There are some significant ways in which it departs from the Jungian model, but I'll focus on a couple just to illustrate why. Again, the conflict of opposites is very important in Jung. It's the very wellspring of psychic energy. It's its source. Now, this conflict of opposites is between conscious and unconscious, of course. But insofar as the type is concerned, it's also a conflict between attitudes. So Jung is always going on about how for every introvert, there is an extroverted side, that it's kind of opposite side. And for any extrovert, there is an introverted side. Presumably, if you are an introvert, the opposite of your dominant is your inferior. And therefore, since as an introvert, your dominant is introverted, your inferior is going to be extroverted. Conversely, if you're extroverted, your inferior is going to be introverted. Now, it's quite clear in the writings of Jung, and I refer you back to chapter 10 general description of the types from the Psychological Types book, that's how he defines the dominant and the inferior. They are not in the same attitude to the world. One is extroverted, one is introverted. Now, the problem is here for an 8-function model of the ego and consciousness is that if you begin with NI and you end with SI, well, you have 2 introverted functions. For an extrovert, so say for an ENFJ, for example, you'd start with FE, pardon me, and instead of having the inferior at TI, you'd have the inferior at TE. So again, you'd have a dominant extroverted function and an inferior. So it's almost like, well, your polarities are both extroverted. So that's a big way in which the system depart from Jung. Again, it's not the point of this video to make an argument from authority and to say Jung has said this, therefore it's not possible. We don't want to bother ourselves with arguments from authority like this. They don't have any value. It's just to emphasize that you're just departing from your Jungian model. So insofar as you think that Jungian model is useful and provides a very good worldview, you just have to be aware that you'd be departing from it. Now, another objection, if I may call it that, to the 8-function in consciousness model is simply that this is not from the Jungian viewpoint. It's not from it's not pointing out that it departs from Jung in this sense. It's more so that it seems to conflict with some very good predictors that the 4-function models have empirically, at the empirical level. So, insofar as a person has a type that's identified correctly, so let's say NI dominant, INTJ or INFJ. We could also take TI dominant, so INTP or ISTP. Empirically, I think that all of us have witnessed what a stressed out INTJ or a stressed out INFJ, how they behave, but they manifest. Similarly for stressed out INTPs and ISTPs, who has not witnessed what is sometimes colloquially called an FE meltdown of an INTP? Anyone who has hung out with INTPs in very many situations has probably witnessed an FE meltdown. And that is very strong, according to me, evidence, not definitive, because it's very hard to have definitive evidence in all cases, but strong evidence that an FE meltdown is the manifestation of the real inferior of the INTP, the source of the grip. And if it's an FE meltdown, then it's an FE, inferior function at work. So FE would be the inferior. What would you do with FI? It was supposedly FI according to the 8-function model. Similarly with the INFJ and the INTJ. I always go back to the character of Beth in, if her name is actually Beth, but the character in The Queen's Gambit, when she goes through this period of high stress, the stress of success, exposure, celebrity, and she just indulges in alcohol and has a very destructive lifestyle. Infantile SE, in this case, infantile polarized SE is a very good narrative to explain why that happens. Again, inferior SE according to the 4-function model. So again, empirically and from a Jungian viewpoint, these are arguments against an 8-function model in consciousness. There are other ones that I will perhaps tackle in a later video, but I just wanted to share these thoughts with you for now. Please let me know what you think, and I will see you tomorrow. Bye-bye, guys.